From time to time, police violence shocks society, causing indignation and revolt. This year in the United States, the murder of George Floyd by a white policeman caused an unprecedented wave of revolt against racism and the police, which spread throughout the country. Several buildings and police stations were set on fire, and dozens of police vehicles were destroyed in popular demonstrations of legitimate anger. In Brazil, the death of black people at the hands of police is so commonplace that it rarely becomes news. Unfortunately, it is not uncommon for children also to be killed in police actions in the favelas and peripheries. But around here, these communities also stand up to show their hatred of police action without gaining much attention from the media and the middle class. The 2020 uprisings in the United States have introduced issues like defunding the police to the national conversation, and even more controversial calls to abolish them altogether. But won't defunding or abolishing the police leave people defenseless against criminals? At the end of the day, aren't the police there to serve and protect? Since we were children, we have been taught that the police exist to protect us from violence, from murderers, rapists, and pedophiles. We learned that if there were no police, people would commit violent acts against each other with impunity, and we would live in an ultra-violent world at the mercy of the strongest. These ideas have pervaded Western culture and are constantly being reaffirmed in television, news, school, or literature, films, and sitcoms where policemen are represented as heroes who protect us from bandits and terrorists. But the reality is quite different. Most of the time, police do nothing in the way of saving a person's life. They answer calls for disturbing the peace, destroying property, robbing cars, drug trafficking, and are the strong arm of the state that will attack informal workers without proper licenses and evict families from their homes when they cannot pay rent. And of course, there's the role they play in repressing demonstrations whenever they harm the functioning of the economy or threaten the status quo. With regard to the greatest crime against individual life, murder, the police do little. In Brazil, less than 8% of homicides are solved. In fact, the police were not even created with the intention of protecting the life of the population. The military police of Rio de Janeiro, for example, was created after the Portuguese royal family came to Brazil in order to protect members of the nobility. That is why in the coat of arms of the PMERJ, we find the crown, representing the royalty, and the acronym GRP of the Royal Police Guard. Their crest also features the sugarcane and coffee plant, which represent the plantations. In other words, the military police of Rio de Janeiro was founded to protect the king and the landowners from the people and to maintain social order. The Sao Paulo military police also has on its coat of arms not only coffee plants, but an image of a pioneer and dozens of stars, with each star representing an act of genocide against indigenous people or repression of rebellions and popular uprisings. One of these stars even represents the participation of the police in the military coup of 1964. Some liberals and part of the left defend the demilitarization of the police through structural reforms, and even hold up the United States police as a positive example, ignoring the fact that police there were also created to keep slaves in line and repress popular uprisings, and that, despite all the reforms they have undergone, they continue to disproportionately kill and arrest black and poor people.
Remember, we only kill black people.
Throughout the history of the West and capitalism, the police have always been a tool of violence against poor, peripheral, black, and indigenous populations. This has been done in the name of protecting the social order, or rather, private property and class structure. In general, the police fulfill the same function today that was assigned to them at their creation. This function is not actually to enforce laws and protect life. This is clear from the fact that police constantly violate the laws they claim to uphold, while they torture and kill every day. The real role of the police and of the judicial and prison system as a whole is to protect the privileges of the ruling class. This is why, when a figure from the elite commits a crime, the police don't know how to proceed, or at least they know they shouldn't act in the same way that they would in a favela. because the police know that if they arrest a businessman or a politician, they will likely be released quickly from the police station or court. Not only that, but the police who arrested them could find themselves punished or prosecuted for daring to threaten their privileges. For centuries, governments have trusted police to reduce violence in our society, and it is obvious that it simply does not work. Since the police protect the unequal distribution of resources, it is to be expected that this helps ensure that inequality will only increase over time, and with it, the violence that results from desperate people refusing to submit to an unfair system. Social inequality and terror maintained by police violence will never bring any kind of peace. Violence against Black, poor, non-cisgender people, demonstrators, homeless, indigenous, political dissidents, and immigrants are not isolated cases, as they would have us believe. The problem is not a few bad apples, but the very institution of the police itself. Yes, there may be well-meaning police officers who want to contribute to a more just society, but their intentions and desires do not matter when they work for an institution that demands obedience to laws and a strict chain of command. We could replace every police officer, sergeant, officer, delegate, and superintendent tomorrow, but if the institution continues to exist, brutality, abuse of power, and torture will continue to exist. It will take a great struggle to liberate our communities from police oppression, which is unlikely to happen until we develop other kinds of tools to re-establish harmony in our communities. A community that cannot resolve its own conflicts cannot expect to triumph against a more powerful force. Until then, opposition to the police should be framed as a fight against one of the most atrocious sources of oppressive violence, not as a claim that without police, violence will cease to exist. That said, if we are ever able to defeat and dismantle the police, we will certainly be able to defend ourselves against less organized threats. When we advocate for the end of the police, it is not because we hate the people who work as cops and want them to go through difficulties and privations as individuals. On the contrary, it is so that no one has to go through things like that. It is so that no one will ever be evicted from their home for not being able to pay rent, imprisoned for trying to get something to eat, or repressed for fighting for justice and freedom. It is because we want a world that is more equal and just. A world where people know that we will be cared for by our communities, that we won't be coerced by capitalism's threats of hunger, disease, and helplessness into accepting humiliating, insecure jobs that go against our values. The end of the police will be beneficial even to the people who work there, who are so psychologically battered by the institution and by the orders they receive, that in Brazil, the number of police officers who take their own lives is greater than those who die in confrontations. But without the police, how do we defend ourselves? Around the world and in history, there are examples of communal self-defense organizations that we can study to come up with autonomous and collective ways to keep ourselves safe. But there is no one-size-fits-all formula. Each community has unique characteristics, and importing ready-made models from abroad almost never works. Further, we already have some idea on a small scale about how to resolve conflicts and violent actions within our communities. When a child or a friend of ours commits an aggression, we don't call the police. We try to resolve it through dialogue, or when that's not possible, in the case of an adult, we cut off relations with that person. Why not seek to apply similar ways to address conflicts within our communities? When we talk about taking responsibility for our own safety and that of our communities, we must be careful not to repeat the punitive standards of the state. Because, like any act of revenge, far from solving the problem, they only reinforce the cycle of violence and injustice. When a violent act happens, our focus must be to do what the state has never done, to care for the victims, to restore community relations, and to think about what we can do so that things like this do not happen again. It is hard to imagine a world without police, where neighbors look after each other, when we have been brought up in a system that stimulates competition and individualism, that fragments and erodes community spirit and despises dialogue and understanding. It will not be easy to regain our ability to work and organize ourselves collectively, and to live together respecting our differences. This is a consequence of having outsourced our powers to the state for so long. But taking back these skills is an essential step towards building a more just world, without the brutal and systemic violence of the police and the entire state apparatus. Let us create this world together, a world where no one oppresses or is oppressed, where no one has to live in fear.